Hi apes! Today we're taking a look at Unit 5, Part 3, and our focus today will be on agriculture. So to start off with, just some vocabulary about food and food availability. So to start with, you might have heard the words famine and undernutrition, malnutrition. These are words that you might have heard but don't have a good definition to. So famine, we mentioned this when we talked about Malthus with populations, but famine is widespread death due to lack of food. So there definitely are areas, particularly in developing countries, where we are seeing widespread death due to this. Now, when just shy of famine is going to be undernutrition, when you literally are not getting enough calories to meet your daily needs. Your body is not getting enough calories to function. Now, malnutrition will often go hand in hand with undernutrition, and that malnutrition is not getting the right types of calories. So technically, you might getting the numbers of calories that you need, but they're not the right type. So you might have a protein deficiency or a vitamin deficiency, and you're going to have problems, health problems associated with that. Now, the flip side of that oftentimes you might see in developed countries is overnutrition, and this is eating too many calories. So here we have the main problems with obesity and heart disease that are often associated with a bad diet. So the bottom line from this is the problem is not food supply. Malthus was technically correct, and that there is enough food to feed our entire world population. But the issue is distribution, that there is just not enough food in the right places. So where we are having these rapidly growing populations, they do not have the food access they need, whereas in developed nations we're seeing a lot of waste, and in some cases having too much food, which is leading to health problems there as well. Now, for our food sources, we're going to go through these in the next several lectures, but most of our food is going to be coming from agriculture, and those agriculture crops are three primary crops around the world are corn, wheat, and rice. We eat a lot of meat, and mostly that will be livestock and poultry. And then finally, a lecture we'll do on fish, so we'll separate these out. So one important thing to associate with agriculture is what we refer to as the Green Revolution. So when we talked about Malthus saying that the world population was going to die from famine, what he didn't take into account was technology. And that every time that we start to get to that point, technology comes in and finds a way to make our plants grow faster and bigger. So initially what we started off with was monoculture, which is the planting of one crop, adding a lot of fertilizer, particularly nitrogens and phosphorus to make it grow faster, and pesticides to protect the crops that we have. So we've been doing these things for a very long time to make our crops grow better. So just to review here, monoculture is one crop. Fertilizer tends to be nitrogens and phosphorus, and that helps plants to grow faster and bigger. And then our pesticides, what they will do is they will help to protect against loss. So they will kill the pests that are trying to eat our food. So this was the first Green Revolution, and we did very, very well with this. But we are potentially currently in a second Green Revolution looking at GMOs, genetically modified organisms. So that could be considered to be our second Green Revolution. So to go through some of these parts of our different types of ways that we've used technology to improve food, one of the most common ways that we farm is using what we refer to as monoculture. So with monoculture, it is just one crop only. You might be a corn farmer or a soybean farmer, and that's all you do. So the thing about monoculture is it is very easy for a farmer because you have one planting season, you have one set of seeds, you have one set of tools that you need, and it is more profitable. So monoculture, there's a reason why we do it a lot. But there are also some downsides. and that if you have a pest that is coming after corn and you're a corn farmer, you are very, very vulnerable to that pest. It's like an all-you-can-eat buffet for that pest. So monoculture makes it very vulnerable to pests. Another thing is that if you're planting the same crops over and over and over again, they're going to be taking the same nutrients out of the soil over and over and over again. So there's a heavy use of fertilizers that can become problems if they run off and enter our streams and add that nutrient pollution to our streams. So the thing is, though, we keep using it because it is more profitable. But add one more problem, and that's the potential for soil erosion. The reason why you have more soil erosion with monoculture is because of that one season planting. So you plant in one season and you harvest in one season, and then you have empty fields all at the same time with no roots to hold on to it, and so you're vulnerable to erosion. Now, our big scale agriculture we refer to as industrialized agriculture, which relies heavily on monoculture. So industrialized agriculture is pretty much how we farm in most of our developed nations. These would be our large scale farms that have a really, really heavy reliance on fossil fuels. So everything they do is going to be mechanized, lots of tractors, lots of plows and things like that. So heavy use of fossil fuels. But that allows them to do farming on a scale that is very, very hard to even imagine. So very, very large scale farming to make a profit. But with that, they do have to do a lot of plowing. That plowing loosens that top layer of soil so that they can plant their seeds. Irrigation, which is addition of water, because we can't rely on rain to do all the watering of this large scale farming. So irrigation is when we water the plants, and we'll go over some different methods of that. Pesticides, because it tends to be monoculture, so to protect the plants and kill the pests that might eat our plants. Monoculture, that one plant for that ease. The fertilizer to make it grow faster. And our machinery to make it just a lot easier. So industrialized agriculture is pretty much what we do in developed nations. Now, irrigation techniques are going to be really, really heavily tied to that type of farming style, that you do have to find ways to water your crops. So we do need to go over our different ways of irrigating our crops. This picture up here to the right, this is furrow irrigation. So you can see these furrows or these alleys of water. So you kind of flood these furrows and water will seep into the soils. Now this is a very common way of irrigating your crops, but you are vulnerable to evaporation because you're letting this water sit here. And so in the warmer summer days, you might have a lot of loss of water to evaporation. You also might have runoff. If there's some type of a slope, water is going to run downhill. Now, flood irrigation is kind of a bigger method of this. Think of like cranberry fields, rice paddies, where you literally flood the fields. And the goal here is to waterlog the soils. So here water gets all trapped into the pore spaces of our soils. That can be damaging to those plants if it's not done properly. It does raise the water table or the access to groundwater. And plants, if you're not doing this right, plants won't be able to absorb oxygen through their roots. You might have to make sure that the soil that you're using is the appropriate type of soil for this type of crops. And because you just have water sitting there, you do have a lot of water loss to evaporation. Now, when you have water loss to evaporation, what happens is the water evaporates, the H2O evaporates, but anything that was in that water is going to stay behind. So if there's a little bit of salt in that water, what's going to happen is the salt content will build up in your soils, and salt can be incredibly toxic to plants. So we call that salinization of the soils or salting of the soils, and that's a big problem with irrigation, particularly these two methods. Now, another thing that in particular these two methods can do, because they're heavy on the water use, is what we call overdraft. And this is taking out too much groundwater. And so groundwater is a resource that takes thousands of years to recharge. And so when we're taking out too much groundwater and losing a lot to evaporation, that's a big loss of that resource. Now, some more sustainable methods of irrigation, we do have two: drip irrigation and spray. So drip irrigation is this first picture here. So drip irrigation is a series of pipes that are on the ground and hoses, and these might be on the surface or just below. And what happens here is water just kind of oozes out right here at the roots. It's very slow. You notice you don't see any pools of water, so you don't have as much loss of evaporation, so it's very, very efficient. But to set this system up and to be able to plant around it is very expensive. But this would be a great method in areas that are very dry, because you're going to conserve the water that you have. Now, this method is probably what we see most often in large-scale farming, and that's spray irrigation. So you might have spray heads set up. Sometimes you might see a truck with spray arms overhead, and it kind of goes over the fields. So you have less loss of evaporation because you're not just forming pools of water, but it still can be expensive, and you might still have some runoff. So drip irrigation is definitely our most sustainable method. So when we want to talk about sustainable agricultural techniques, monoculture is not that. So monoculture, remember, is one type of crop. So polyculture is many types of crops. Now, a synonym for polyculture is intercropping. So we have two or more species at the same time. So this picture here has rows of corn and rows of soybean. Now, this is a common combination that you might see because corn takes nitrogen out of the soils, whereas soybean puts it into the soils. So you might have this system of a sustainable agricultural technique to reduce the amount of fertilizers that you might need. So it really does a much better method of conserving your soils and conserving the nutrients in your soils. Now, another method is crop rotation, where you might have different crops planted at different seasons. So you might have a crop in the spring, a crop in the summer, a crop in the fall, and maybe a cover crop in the winter. Now, the goal of a crop rotation like this is to make sure that you have something on your soils year-round so that you can help protect your soils from erosion. And hopefully they will have different nutritional needs and maybe some that would add nutrients to your soils. Now, organic farming is kind of a generalized term that we might use that is trying to go after that sustainable approach. Now, with organic farming, this can be small or it can be much larger scale now, but it has a few key characteristics. One thing is that you use no synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. Okay, so that synthetic is actually a really important word because that doesn't mean they don't use pesticides or fertilizers. It just means that they're natural. There are some really, really nasty pesticides out there that are completely natural, and it is okay to use that in organic farming. Fertilizers, a very good organic fertilizer is manure or poo. So they'll put that on their crops and that adds the nutrients that they need. So with organic farming, the key thing is that they're using ecological principles. They're trying to mimic nature. They're growing lots of different crops at the same time that covers the entire season. And the goal is to keep the nutrients in the soil because that's what the plants need to grow. Now, some other types of techniques to conserve your soil, because that's the key resource with farming. One is not plowing. Now, this makes it a lot more difficult by not stirring up the top layers of those soils, but you leave your soils intact. A lot of times they'll just do a slit to put the seeds into. So not plowing is what we refer to as no-till. Low-till is very low plowing, so not a lot of plowing. Another method to help to protect against wind, which is a big driver of erosion, are what we refer to as windbreaks. So here you can see this is a wall of bushes that are surrounding the crops. And it looks like they've got some polyculture going on here because I can see different colors. So I'm assuming these are different types of plants. So here, this is a really good example of some sustainable agricultural techniques. So they set up a windbreak to prevent wind erosion. With agroforestry, this is very similar. You might have some orchards, some apples or peaches. And the key here again is to protect your soils. So you're planting your crops in between rows of trees to protect against wind and water erosion. Coming down here, this would be farming on a hillside. So terracing is building these stair steps. Okay, so this is a steep slope. Okay, so originally it might have looked like that. But you can't you can't farm on a steep slope like this because if you water your crops, the soil and the water will just run off downhill. And so what they do is they build these platforms out. And that's what terracing is. So this is only going to be done in extreme measures. If you don't have to farm on the side of a mountain, don't farm on the side of a mountain because this is not easy to do. Now contour plowing is plowing against the slope. So this is going to be a much more gentle slope. Okay, so if our slope is going down this way, you don't want your crops going parallel to the slope of the hill. You want your crops going perpendicular so that when water does flow downhill, it's going to keep hitting those layers of those rows of crops. So contour plowing is planting perpendicular to the slope of the hill. And that's all to conserve water and soil. Now we referred to GMOs earlier as a second green revolution. So GMOs are genetically modified organisms. So this is technology's answers to today's problem with food. Now, the benefits of genetically modified organisms is we can get a much greater yield. We can make them grow faster. We can make them grow shorter growing seasons. We can make them grow larger. We can reduce the amount of chemical pesticides because they can have a pesticide built in. So we can make them pest resistant so we don't have to apply chemicals. And we can also change the nutrition. We can add nutrients to things. So we can greatly change these. Now, a lot of people still are concerned about genetically modified organisms. They have been around for about 50 years or so in the form that we see today. There potentially are health risks long term. There's no evidence that says they have health risks at this point. And one thing to consider is that pretty much since we've been growing plants, we've been genetically modifying plants. We take two different types of plants and we crossbreed them. That is genetically modifying plants. So most of the concern comes from inserting genes, but we have not seen any evidence that that is causing any type of long-term health scares. The key thing that genetically modified organisms might do is get released into the wild, and that's going to reduce the biodiversity because the changes that we're making make them a much better competitor. And if those traits get out into the wild, you're going to reduce the genetic biodiversity of what we see. Now, the last thing to talk about here is pesticides. I refer to it as methods that have to be done to help to conserve the crops that we have. So pesticides are typically necessary, but there are ways to reduce the impacts of it. And one of the most sustainable approaches to pesticides is what we refer to as IPM, or Integrated Pest Management. Now, integrated pest management, its goal is to reduce chemical pesticides. So the things that it relies on is one, biological control. What we need to realize is there are insects out there that are carnivorous. And so if we encourage those carnivorous insects to come into your crop fields, they're not going to bother your plants, but they will eat the pests that do. So things like spiders and ladybugs, you might not want to see them on your food, but they don't care about your food, but they're going to be eating the pests that eat your food. Another big method incorporated into IPM is polyculture. So remember, this is planting many different types of crops, so that if you do have a pest that comes in and maybe attacks your corn, you're not going to have a complete loss of your farm because you have different crops there. It also makes it more difficult for that pest to spread because they're going to be kind of blocked in their path. There's also physical methods that you might use. Scarecrows to scare away birds, screens to block insects from getting in. Now, IPM can use pesticides, but the goal of this, remember, is to reduce the chemical pests while keeping the pests at a manageable level. So if you do have pesticides, you might use narrow spectrum, and this is going to target a very specific pest. And so pesticides are allowed, but not ones that will just kill anything in its path. So pesticides, like we said, could be narrow spectrum or broad spectrum. So the narrow spectrum is that very specific, and our broad spectrum can kill a lot of things. So the broad spectrum are our older types of pesticides, and as technology is improving, most of them are becoming narrow spectrum. Now, one of the biggest concerns about pesticides is they are known to do what we call biomagnify. So here they become more concentrated as you move up the food chain. So this picture always reminds me of biomagnification, because if you have a pesticide like DDT that got into the water on some algae, this little guy might eat one. This little guy will eat that yellow fish, but he might eat 3 of his friends. And then this little guy is going to eat the green guy with 4 or 5 DDTs in it. And he's going to eat several of him. So the DDT becomes more and more concentrated at the higher levels of the food chain. Now, DDT is a pesticide that was used heavily in our 50s, mostly for mosquito control. And this picture here is of children running after a truck that's spraying DDT. Now, DDT, we do know, biomagnifies up the food chain. And the way we saw that is that it magnified itself into our bald eagles, and it weakened their eggshells. So when the bald eagles would sit on their nests, they would crack all their baby eggs. And that was an unintended consequence. We wouldn't know that that happened, but it wasn't until years later after using DDT that we found out that it did that. Now, another problem with DDT that we know now is it's a carcinogen. It's a cancer-causing agent. So we no longer use DDT in the United States. So just to sum up our pesticides, there are pros and cons to everything. So some of the pros is that it saves lives, like that DDT. It is a great killer of mosquitoes. And one of the big disease-causing agents that mosquitoes carry is malaria. So DDT is actually still used in some countries to spray mosquito netting to help save lives. It definitely increases food supplies and therefore increases profits. The newer ones are narrow spectrum so that they don't kill as many things. They kill only your targeted organism, and they can work very, very fast. Now, the bad side is that critters can become very quickly genetically resistant to it. Remember that insects are selected. They reproduce very quickly, and they have lots and lots of offspring. And so what that means is they can go through natural selection very, very quickly. And so if you leave a few pests that are resistant to that pesticide behind, they will pass that trait on to their offspring. Persistence, what this means is that it sticks around in the environment. Even though we haven't used DDT in decades, you can still find it in soils. There are unintended reactions in the environment, like the eggshells of our eagles after being exposed to DDT. Health effects, many of them are carcinogens. They are meant to kill things, and they are meant to kill animal cells. They might kill beneficial species that you're not trying to go after if they're broad spectrum. So they might kill lots of things. And here, pesticide mobility, it travels. It gets into the air, it gets into the water, and it travels to other areas. So even though pesticides are necessary, there definitely are some pros and cons to both, and it is important to weigh both sides.